That's fine. Nope. Yep. Okay. Give me 1 second to get one more thing set up, but otherwise we're gonna get started. So, we are today doing another one of these Audubon shows. So this is going to be a series of shows, and I guess at this point has been since this is the second one, a series of shows covering fish and fishing in Minnesota. And so these are shows that are being funded by the Audubon Society through the Headwaters Science Center. And 1 second there. If you watched last week, we talked about a group of fish called the true sunfishes, which included bluegills, pumpkin seeds, and the green sunfish, all species that you can find in Minnesota. And today you can see I've titled this one, The Other Sunfishes, because sunfish is a much bigger group, and there's a lot of fish within the sunfish group that we don't necessarily think of sunfishes, and so we're thinking about that group today. And in particular, the ones that are included in the true sunfishes are, of course, black crappies, white crappies, the rock bass, which despite being called a bass is actually more closely related to crappies, and then the large and smallmouth bass. So yeah, we don't necessarily think of them that way, but bass are actually pretty closely related to things like bluegills and whatnot, and so they get called sunfishes just like the bluegills and whatnot do. And so, oh yeah, it's right there. The species that we have included today are crappies, and then I put the rock bass and the bass because they commonly get called bass, but like I said, they're actually more closely related to crappies. And so some common things we're seeing, same stuff we talked about last week for some of these things, the short, wide bodies. So we talked last week about the term panfish a little bit, and these guys still, in a lot of ways, would be considered to be panfish because the pan in panfish is, despite common usage, not technically a thing about size. It is a thing about the shape of the body. And so when I say a panfish, I mean a fish that is short and round, basically, is what I'm talking about. And you can see, well, crappies pretty well exemplify that shape of a panfish there. The other thing that's true for all the sunfishes, true and untrue, are the two-part dorsal fin. And you can see it well on this crappie here, where the front portion of the dorsal fin you can see is kind of pokey here. And anybody who's caught a crappie or a bluegill or whatever can attest to that, is that, when you try and grab them, they a lot of times have those pokies on the top, so you got to be careful about how you hold them. But then they also have like a second portion of their dorsal fin, the rear part, that is a little bit softer. The one thing that's different about these guys compared to the, like I said, the more true sunfish, are that they are suction feeders. We talked last week about how the bluegills and sunfish and whatnot have one of the challenges they have when they're eating is that their mouths are really, really small. And so when you're a bluegill, like the way you're catching your food basically is you're opening your mouth, you're swimming around your thing, and you're closing your mouth around it. Whereas these guys tend to do the opposite. They swim up behind the thing, they open their mouth really quickly, a bunch of water floods into their mouth, and hopefully whatever they were trying to eat comes with it. So these guys are called suction feeders, and they're able to do that because they have much bigger mouths. Crappies. So we have two species of crappies in Minnesota. Around Bemidji, where we are, you're really only going to see the one species. I'm seeing right now that my graphic on the stream is covering up my picture of one of them. I'm going to move that quick. Maybe. I can see my mouse from this far away. Oh, my mouse isn't on that computer. I got two computers running. So behind my Headwaters Science Center's logo that you're seeing on the stream, and I guess for my audience here, not a problem for you, we have the black crappie. And so this is the one that you will see around northern Minnesota. We have a few lakes up here that are pretty well known as crappie lakes. I know less so now, but Red Lake in particular used to really be known as a big crappie lake. Then the other one we have is the white crappie, which you're more likely to see down in the southern part of the state. They tend to be found more in rivers and whatnot down there. And very closely related species. I mean, you can see right away how many similarities they have, and the biggest difference you're going to see with them is just the pattern. And like the way I've always identified them, there's a certain element where you can look at them and you can just see yeah, I see why one is called a black crappie because it's darker, and one a white crappie because it's lighter. But in practice, when you're actually catching it and pulling it out of the water and don't have a direct compare to, it can sometimes be a little tricky just to judge on that level. And so the thing I've always sort of trained myself to look for when I'm telling the difference between black and white crappies is black crappies are like speckly on the side, whereas the white crappies, the stripes, are the more prominent pattern. They have a little speckling too, but they tend to be formed into sort of bars or stripes on the side, almost like a little tiger pattern. And they're kind of weird among the sunfishes. Most sunfish we don't tend to not think of as food fish. People tend to not like eat bass. Like it's not a thing that people really do. People don't really eat pumpkin seeds. People don't really eat green sunfish. People eat bluegills some, but crappies are like the one that gets really heavily fished, like specifically as a food fish. Like I think every time I've ever fished for crappies, specifically in my life, it's been for the purpose of eating them later. You'll catch them every once in a while by accident, but if I'm ever going out and I'm saying, hey, I'm crappie fishing, I'm also eating crappie that evening, which is, like I said, atypical. Yes, question from the audience.
Why don't people want to eat them? Do they just not taste good, or?
So yeah, the question was, why do people not eat other sunfishes?
Bass.
What?
Or bass.
Yeah, and bass. And so yeah, the part of it for some of them, things like pumpkin seeds and green sunfish, they just like aren't really big enough to get enough meat off of reasonably to make it worth doing. So that's why people tend to eat bluegills rather than them, is because bluegills get a little bit bigger than those, and you can actually get a decent fillet off of them if it's a big enough bluegill. For the bass, like the largemouth and smallmouth bass, yeah, people tend to just not think the meat is great. I've had largemouth bass. I don't mind it. It's fine. I don't know if I've ever eaten smallmouth bass. That's a good question. But yeah, as far as largemouth bass, like personally, I think it's fine. Rock bass too. People don't eat rock bass because it kind of has a perception of being a dirty fish because of something we'll get into later. But yeah, rock bass, the meat is fine. I've got a bag of rock bass fillets in my freezer right now that I am gonna fry up one of these days. But yeah, crappie, when you're talking crappie, you're talking big flaky meat. Like it's honestly not my favorite. Like when I'm eating fish, I tend to prefer things like perch and walleye and stuff like that. But there are a lot of people who actually really like crappie. I said personally, it's not my thing. But I've gone fishing with people who were, I don't know if I've ever gone out and targeted crappies myself. They're not my favorite to fish for. They're not my favorite to eat either. But if you are fishing for crappies, do a slight adjustment to my camera here. If you are fishing for crappies, like they're not a challenging catch. They're not known for being one that's really hard to track down or really hard to fight when you're fighting them, because they're not that big. Like the record crappies in Minnesota are like, I don't even remember. I looked it up for this, but I don't remember what it was. It was like 2 pounds or something like that for both of them. They're pretty similar size. But they primarily feed on smaller fish, which, like I said, is a product of having a larger mouth. We talked a little bit about the green sunfish last week, kind of having a similar thing, where they have a little bit bigger mouth than the pumpkin seeds and the bluegills, which actually lets them catch other fish, whereas things like bluegills and pumpkin seeds have to eat primarily insect larvae, is what they mostly feed off of in the wild. And so for crappies, a lot of times you're jigging. You can find them in pretty shallow areas throughout the summer. And the thing that like crappies are very like deeply associated, like when I'm thinking, okay, I'm fishing crappies, what I'm looking for is like submerged, like woody stuff. I'm looking for trees that are sunken, branches, log piles, all this stuff. Tends to be the areas where you tend to find crappies, because that tends to be the areas where you're finding, you know, these much smaller fish that they're feeding off of too. And so a lot of times, like, just a good general thing when you're fishing is like learn what these fish are like primarily feeding off of, and then go where that stuff is, and you'll probably find those fish there too. And so, like I said, in the context of crappies, look for structure, look for kind of rigid, long-lasting stuff. They tend to not be like in like really weedy areas in my experience. They tend to get out competed by like the bluegills and whatnot in that area. But yeah, go find a sunken tree. You're gonna find some crappies by it a lot of the time. People do cast for them with sort of surface, like just below the surface spinnerbait stuff. Personally, I've never had much luck with it, but it is a thing that I know people do. And very specifically, they're a dawn and dusk fish. You'll hear a lot of fish described as a morning bite or an evening bite, a night bite, day bite, whatever. Crappie, maybe more than anything I've talked about so far, and at least in the context of this presentation, probably will talk about, are very deeply associated with being active at dawn and dusk.
Ryan?
Yes?
Can you check,
I'm doing a show right now.
oh my god,
Other responsibilities. The other thing that's a little different with crappies, and we talked again a little bit about this with the bluegills last week, and what you're seeing is that a lot of the stuff about crappies is stuff that applies to some of these other sunfish we talked about last week. But one thing that's rare for most types of sunfish is most of them aren't very active in the winter. Their metabolisms really slow down in the winter, which is true for all fish. But crappies are one of the rare ones that actually stays pretty active through winter, so there is a lot of ice fishing that actually happens for crappies in the winter. Similar to most stuff, they just tend to move into a little bit deeper water. They tend to hang out around the same type of stuff, except instead of doing it in 5 feet of water near the shore, now they're doing it in 15 feet of water a little ways off the shore. So again, look for submerged structure and go jig around them. Drop a minnow down there, you'll find them. They're down there. Rock bass. And so rock bass are probably the one that you're, if you're just like day one trying to go fishing in Minnesota, like take your bobber, take your worm, throw it off the dock, you'll probably catch a rock bass at some point. And so we talked a minute ago about rock bass as sort of their perception as being sort of a dirty fish, and so people don't eat them very much. And that's because they are major carriers of something called Neascus, or what's commonly referred to as black spot disease. And Neascus is a parasite that you'll see on a lot of fish. So if you ever catch a fish and pull it up and you notice, especially around the fronts of the fins here, right around the base, you'll see a bunch of little black flecks on it that are a little bit raised. That's Neascus. Neascus isn't dangerous to people at all. People can't carry it. And the little flecks you're seeing aren't even the actual parasites itself. It's like a symptom of having it. But yeah, as long as you're cooking your fish, you're not gonna pick up Neascus from a rock bass. And what it is, it's a parasite that primarily it matures in fish. It originates in birds. Birds poop it out. Snails eat the poop. It exists in the snails for a while in a larval state, and then whenever something eats the snails, they pick it up, and then it matures in there. And then when that fish gets eaten by a bird, it gets picked up back into the bird. It's a sort of cycle: bird to snail to fish to back to bird. And yeah, you'll see it in really heavy cases, when you fillet it, you'll see the marks of it a little bit in the fillets. But again, as long as you're cooking your fish, it's fine. And yeah, despite the name, more closely related to things like crappies. But I really like rock bass. Like I said, they're one where I'm primarily a sport fisherman. If I'm going out fishing, it's usually for fun. I'm not trying to get a meal out of it. And so my perception of rock bass is very much the I'm throwing something off the dock, and the fish that's putting up the best fight off the dock a lot of the time is going to be rock bass, because they're a little bit bigger than the bluegills and sunfish and stuff that you're going to catch out there. As I said, they just fight a little bit harder. And yeah, like I said, they'll eat on pretty much anything you throw out there. I've literally caught them on just bare hooks before. And so they are a commonly seen fish, but an often maligned fish, a fish that people tend to not like. I remember as a kid, I would go fishing with my friends too, and I remember my friends would whenever they would catch them, they'd just throw them on the shore. Because the wives' tale on it, I don't know if it's true or not, but the wives' tale was that they eat walleye eggs. And so this is a thing you'll hear about a lot of fish, and interestingly enough, they tend to be fish that are not thought of as pretty fish, will get this accused of them as an excuse to kill them. Like I said, I don't know if it's actually true or not. I haven't seen anything in particular ever that says any real evidence as far as rock bass specifically targeting walleye eggs, but I remember this being a thing that was repeated to me by people I knew consistently as a kid is, oh yeah, we gotta kill them because they eat walleye eggs, and God forbid we have anything that can affect the walleye population in any lake. And so we I said, as a kid, my peers would often, like I said, throw them on the shore because that's what their parents did, because they cared about the walleye and nothing else, basically. So I got a soft spot for the rock bass. I said, as a sport fisherman who tends to not target for feeding purposes, they're a great one. Great one to fish for off the dock because they're great fighters. And also, like I said, I tend not to eat them just because I don't eat much fish, but they're not bad. They're fine. Smallmouth bass. Now we're getting into a little bit bigger ones, and the ones that, probably you're less associated with just like catching off the dock. The smallmouth bass is one of the bigger members of this family. And I guess one of the things I didn't touch on before as an identifying feature for rock bass, like you'll catch a rock bass and sometimes it can be kind of tricky to tell these fish apart. One of the things that is really iconic for rock bass is they have red eyes. And so if you pull a thing off the dock, it's got red eyes, it's probably a rock bass. But the other thing you could potentially catch is that I have caught smallmouth bass off the dock. It's not something I ever expect to be catching when I'm fishing off the dock. But smallmouth bass also have a similar reddish, kind of orangish eye that makes them easy to distinguish from the largemouth bass that we'll talk about in a second here. A little bit longer and thinner than the other ones we've been talking about, the crappies and bluegills and all that. A little bit bigger fish, a little bit more active predatory fish. And again, we're talking pretty substantially bigger, where this is a fish that is, not unheard of for this fish to get to be 5-6 pounds. Those fish are just out there swimming in any given lake in Minnesota. So the state record is 8 pounds. Obviously, that's an exceptionally large one, but it does speak to how big you can expect to see these fish if you're catching a decent-sized one. And if you are fishing for these guys, again, they're a little bit different than the rest of them. One of the things that is really weird about these guys is they tend to hang out in open water and a little bit deeper water. What we've been talking about with all the ones we've talked about previously is that they mostly, at least during the ice-off months, are hanging pretty close to the shore. And part of that is because they're small. And if you go out in open water, you got to deal with bigger fish out there. Smallmouth bass are big enough that they can actually go out and hang out in the little bit deeper water and not have to worry about getting just nailed by a muskie or whatever out there. And so they are able to hang out in a little bit deeper water and be a little bit more active predators. 15-20 feet is sort of where I most associate fishing for smallmouth bass in the spring and summer. And the big feature I'm always looking for with them is I want somewhere that has a rocky bottom and is near a little bit deeper water. And the thing you most associate smallmouth bass with eating is crayfish. And so if you see baits that are targeted at smallmouth bass, a lot of them are crayfish shaped or patterned or whatever. But they'll eat all sorts of stuff. Smaller fish, insects. If anybody's eating walleye eggs, it's probably these guys because they're hanging out in pretty similar areas to the walleyes a lot of the time. And they, like I said, are going to be in a little bit deeper, cooler water. Crankbaits are sort of the thing I most associate fishing with when you go out in an open area, you find somewhere with a relatively, rocky-ish. And yeah, they're another one that in the dawn and dusk as well are sometimes associated with coming in a little bit shallower. So yeah, if you're out fishing off the dock and at 7 p.m., that's the time when you're gonna catch a smallie in the shallows somewhere. And of course the largemouth bass. So this is the largest member of the freshwater sunfishes. So the state record in this one is almost 9 pounds, which is a very big largemouth bass, obviously. But these guys are pretty consistently the biggest ones. And the tricky one, as far as identifying between largemouth bass and smallmouth bass, because they're pretty similar shapes, they oftentimes are pretty similar sizes. If you're sitting there and looking at them one right next to another, I would generally describe largemouth bass as being sort of greenish in color, whereas smallies I associate more with being sort of brownish. But they can have similar patterns. You see the striping on the gill plate is true across both of them. But the thing I look for in a largemouth bass is this one really heavy stripe down the side, and especially when they're underwater, that's really visible, I find. So like, again, if you're off the dock, because this is a fish that you will sometimes see off the dock, the smaller ones especially, will be hanging out pretty close to shore a lot of the time near the docks. And you'll look and you'll see these fish that just have like a thick, heavy black stripe down the side. Those are largemouth bass. And they start out pretty thin when they're little, like the smaller ones are like almost like perch shaped when they're little, but then as they get bigger, they get sort of more stout and heavy. And when you see the really big ones, it looks like they swallowed a basketball. Like they just get like fatter and fatter and fatter in this region as they get bigger. As I said, not really targeted as a food fish very much. Honestly, you don't super know why, other than I guess people just don't think the meat is that good. Like I said, I've had it, it's fine. But yeah, greenish on the back, cream-colored belly, very classic sort of predator coloration. Yes, another question from the audience.
So the record is 8, almost 9 pounds. How much does a regular, normal largemouth bass typically weigh?
Yeah, I said the record is about 9 pounds. And obviously they can come in a lot of different sizes. You can catch them off the dock that are, less than a pound, of the same sort of scale as, bluegills and perch and that type of thing. Like you'll catch them off the dock that way because, as the name implies, they have a big enough mouth to actually get. If I catch one that's like 7 pounds, like that's maybe one that I'm thinking about like mounting as a trophy fish. If I catch one, it's weird because I don't normally weigh my fish when I'm like catching them. I normally go by length. And like in my brain, like a big largemouth bass is like 16, 17, 18 inches. And like once you start getting past that, now we're getting into like potentially like trophy size fish. But yeah, like it's not crazy to catch one that's a foot long off the dock, like it happens. And those like, once you start getting into like 18, 19, 20 sort of inches, you're talking probably 6-ish pounds, I would guess, somewhere in that neighborhood. But yeah, the largest in size, but also the largest as far as the size of their mouth goes, which again means you'll catch them. You'll kind of catch them smaller than you will a lot of other ones, but you can also catch them a lot bigger because they get bigger. Because again, the limitation for a lot of these fish is how small their mouth is and how reasonable is it for them to even get their mouth onto a hook, and it's not an issue for these guys. So these guys are big time suction feeders. This is like their thing that they're like very much known for, is they specifically target stuff on the surface a lot. And so the big difference between these guys and smallies, as far as like the way you're fishing for them, is these guys hang out in much shallower water most of the time. These guys are really heavily associated with like really weedy areas. So that can sometimes be sort of the tricky part with them, is you'll hook them and then they'll dive right back into the weeds, and now your line is tangled up in the weeds with them. So you gotta go in after them. You can see even in my picture here, there's a guy in waders who is going out to get this fish. They're not picky about what they eat. They'll eat pretty much anything that fits in their mouth, and like I said, for the big ones, it's pretty much anything. You'll even hear them associated with eating things like ducklings and like muskrats and stuff that are swimming across the surface. So yeah, they come up underneath, again, open their mouth really fast, bring a bunch of water down in it, and eat whatever in one bite, basically, is the goal. And if you're fishing for them, again, surface and near surface stuff tends to be the thing. Find a really weedy area, throw a Rapala out there and skid it across the surface, and you're more than likely going to see some largemouth bass interest. I grew up fishing for them in lily pads primarily, was sort of the thing that I always did. Again, it gets tricky when you're doing in pad fields because, again, they'll get all tangled up in the stems for the pads as soon as they hit the thing. But like the thing when you associate largemouth bass with is they are like the sport fish. Like it's the fish that people target when they're trying to fish for fun. Because they hang out near the surface and near shorelines, they're pretty easy to target. And you also get like a real spectacle with them when they hit sometimes. So that's like when I think about largemouth bass fishing, I think about throwing like a weedless frog into a set of lily pads, dragging it across the pads, and you see the big explosion that happens when the largemouth bass comes up from underneath and hits that frog, and then having to fight it out of the weeds to get it to the boat, and it is jumping and what they call tail walking, where it gets up out of the water and it's wiggling and it looks like its tail is just touching the surface of the water. said they're a spectacle of a fish to fight because they're big, they fight really hard, and like I said, you find them near the surface. So you can compare it with something, something like a smallmouth bass. Most of the fight is happening under the water. A lot of times you don't know it's a smallmouth bass until you get it close to the surface and actually see it. The largemouth bass, there's really never any mistake what you're fishing for because, like I said, if it hits it near the surface, a lot of the times it's going to hit it really hard and you're going to know right away, and it's going to be fighting you right on the surface as well. So, like I said, it's an entertaining fight, and so they get targeted really heavily by fishermen. This is why, like, the fishing circuits, like the professional fishing, all target largemouth bass, is because it's, one that a lot of people, target as a sport fish, so there's a bigger market for it, but also it's a spectacle for TV, even, when it comes to doing that type of stuff, because, like I said, they fight near the surface. You can actually catch them on camera when they're fighting. So yeah, one of my favorites to go after. It's a fun fish. Like I said, one that people tend not to eat too. And like I said, they somehow managed to avoid that, by being like a popular sport fish, they managed to avoid that, like, ooh, they eat walleye eggs thing that a lot of these fish tend to fall into. And so they haven't had their populations hurt by people killing them deliberately either. And so, I think that's my last slide. Yep. Anyway, thank you guys for hanging out with me today. So these are shows that we are doing once a week. So every Saturday around 10:30-ish is about when we've been doing them. As long as my technology allows it. Sometimes we have some tech difficulties down here in the basement. But we are going to continue doing this, so talking about specific sort of groups of fishes as far as sort of basic biology around them, how that biology affects how we fish for them is sort of the theme of these. And so I think next week, let's see, what do I want to do next week? Let's talk about, I'm making the decision right now. We're going to talk about perch, walleye, and sauger next week. We're going to talk about walleye and friends. So, look forward to that next week. Thank you guys again for watching, and we will see you 10:30-ish a week from now.